Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world right now. Welcome to the Friday Happy Hour live webcast from WhiskyCast.com. I'm Mark Gillespie in the WhiskyCast studio in Haddonfield, New Jersey. Hope you've had a good week. It is raining here today. Kept me from having to go out and do yard work today, but probably will be out doing that tomorrow. Hope that you're ready to have some fun tonight because we have a couple of rye whiskey gurus joining us right now. I want to bring in our pal Herman Mihalich from Dad's Hat Rye over in Bristol, Pennsylvania, and Alex Munch joining us all the way from Denmark tonight at Stauning Distillery. Both these guys make rye whiskeys, and Stauning is also making a single and triple malts, and we'll talk about those in a second. Guys, how are you tonight?
Fine, thank you.
Fantastic, thanks.
Now, well, it's the obvious question. What's in your glasses tonight? Alex, we'll start with you since it's much later over there.
It's 11 p.m., yeah, so it's quite late here in Denmark. I've got a rye whiskey aged in a rum cask in my glass right now.
Nice.
Tell us about it.
Well, actually, it's I have the bottle right here. I don't know if you can see it or it's too, yeah, there you got it.
Okay.
Cask-Strength, single cask. In a Cuban rum cask, so it's a not too spicy, a bit sweet. It's been 3 years in an in a Virgin American white oak cask, and then about 7 months in a rum cask.
Herman, what do you have tonight?
Sounds delicious. My business partner John and I have recently started doing single barrel selections, much like many of the stores have been doing with our barrels. We decided to pick some for ourselves. And this is, the first one's gone, and this is the second one, which just came out this week. It's if you can see that, it's a single barrel. It's from the warmest part of our storage area. So this is a fairly high, it went in at 120 proof. It's a 134. So we've never had a cask that strong, and despite the fact that it's got the high alcohol, we're very pleased with it. So this is now Founder's number 2, Founder's Cask Selection number 2, bottled at 134 or 67 ABV. So it's it packs a bit of a punch, but it doesn't drink like 134. I must say. I mean, it's we're very pleased. We have a part of our distillery where we keep a certain number of our 53-gallon casks is really kind of the hottest part of the whole complex. So we have some casks down there, and this one happens to be from there. Most of our 53-gallon barrels are aging on the 5th floor of the building, which is Mark, as you probably remember, it's an old 100-year-old plus textile mill that was built in the early days of reinforced concrete, and they over-engineered it so the walls are probably half a meter or more thick, and they're so it maintains a pretty constant temperature there. But this barrel comes from a part of the distillery that sees quite a bit of heat. So
that concrete absorbs a lot of heat and doesn't let it go, does it?
That's correct, and it never gets very cold up there, and in the summertime, it frankly doesn't get all that hot either. But it's a pretty constant temperature environment, which is kind of a characteristic of the old school Pennsylvania Ryes. They were mostly stored in brick warehouses that were more of a controlled environment than the rick houses in Kentucky.
Let's sort of get the origin stories for both of you, and we'll start with Alex first, since you have not been around as long, I believe, as Dad's Hat. So we'll start with the Stauning origin story first. How did you guys get started?
Well, it goes back to 2005. One of my friends, Martin Vesterby, actually they're 3 brothers, Martin, Lasse, and Jesper. Martin heard this radio program about whiskey on his way to a summer house. And in that program, they said it's easy to make whiskey, but it's difficult to make good whiskey. So Martin went to the summer house and met up with his family, his brother and his father and mother's brother, and they discussed the possibility of trying to make a Danish single malt whiskey or whiskey. Is it possible to make whiskey in Denmark? And they agreed on that it should be possible. We do export a lot of grain, and we are about the same height as Scotland on the map. So why not? They called some friends. I'm one of the friends, and shortly after we started the project of making a Danish whiskey. Our ambition was to make a whiskey similar to a Scotch single malt Islay type whiskey, peat smoked. And we started up in Munch. The father, he was a butcher, his abattoir, making the first alcohol in 2006. So imagine a 20 square meter abattoir using the meat grinder to grind the grain, using the fridge or the freezer to floor malt, small direct fired pot stills. We used the chimney or the oven where you smoke the meat. We would smoke the grain, local grain, local barley, and also we used local peat. So everything was from this area of Stauning, the west coast in Denmark. West coast Denmark is not like west coast Scotland. West coast Denmark is flat, totally flat sand. So we don't have any cliffs, but the environment is pretty rough. A lot of wind. It's near the sea. So very similar to how it is in Scotland. And we had a dream of making an Ardbeg from 1977, similar to the 77 Ardbeg, which was, we think, one of the best whiskies we had ever tasted. So we started up distilling and made the first batch. And I think actually we got maybe a bit lucky with our first batch. It was smoky, it was nice, fruity. And shortly after we continued this process. We were lucky to meet some of the whiskey experts of the world, and they said, "Why don't you make rye whiskey? Rye is from Denmark, has a lot of rye. We have the culture where we eat a lot of rye, but not. I hope I'm not offending anybody now in this program, because we said no, whiskey must be Scotch. Not American. That's bourbon." That's poker. That's Las Vegas. That's the thought from a Dane. But then we started tasting on rye whiskies and bourbon whiskies, and we were like, not that bad. So shortly after, we started distilling or making the first rye. I remember tasting the Thomas Handy, and it kind of blew my world of whiskey making. It was just like, holy crap, this is great stuff. So we agreed on trying to make the first rye whiskey in Denmark, and we do it as a single malt whiskey. So it's basically floor malted rye grain that we double distill, and we have our own mash tun. We've created our own mash tun to make this work, because as you know, rye is some sticky stuff, not easy to work with, especially when you want to do a mash tun, a mash filtering. And so we decided to make kind of a washing machine to mash the rye, to really tumble the grain around and making it work together with the water, so we could get some sugar out of that starch, and it worked perfectly. So now you should see the invention we've made at the distillery, both the floor malting, where we do automatic turning of the grain on the floor. We steep on the floor, we turn the grain on the floor with a machine, do this special mashing, and then a double distillation, double pot still distillation. So whiskey came from, is it possible to make whiskey in Denmark? 9 founders, 4 engineers, a helicopter pilot, a doctor, a chef, a butcher, and a teacher that actually knew nothing about whiskey, kind of went together and got the interest of making whiskey. And here we are today. Now we have a new distillery at the West Coast, 24 pot stills, 16 wash stills, 8 spirit stills, 2,500 square meters of floor malting. We still floor malt all our grain, both the rye and the barley, do a special mashing. So we've kept, how we started in the small abattoir, and still do that today. So a different whiskey, also in flavor. You've tasted it, Mark. We try to do a Danish whiskey, not a Scotch whiskey now. We kind of found out that it's great to do whiskey similar to Scotch or Japanese, Irish, but when you are from Denmark, you don't want to make a copy of another country's whiskey. You want to create your own products. Scotch make fantastic whiskey. US, Americans make amazing bourbons and rye. Try to make your own style of whiskey. So that's what we do today. And we feel very proud about that. And very proud that it is not like other whiskeys out there. So, yeah.
Herman, we have told your story before, how you and John were college classmates together. back in the day.
Yep.
But
That's
bring
true.
us up to date. Give us the origin story on how you guys moved into that really overbuilt building up in Bristol, PA.
Yeah, actually, it sounds like Alex predates us because we didn't get started until 2010, 2011. My backstory is that I grew up in a bar in Western Pennsylvania. My grandfather was a rye whiskey drinker. He drank rye whiskey from the old Gibson Distillery back more than 100 years ago when he was a young man, working in the local still mill and drinking rye whiskey from the distillery. It was located about 2 miles from my home when I grew up, and so he was working in the still mill. He decided to when Prohibition came along, he decided working in the still mill was not so much fun, and he started a speakeasy that became our family tavern. And that's where I grew up, is in the apartment upstairs from the tavern, and with my grandfather and my father both being rye whiskey drinkers and servers, of course. And so that was always on my mind. And I remember my grandfather in his older years, in his 80s and 90s, he would have a little bit of rye whiskey before dinner. That was, he called his medicine. So that was in my mind. And when there was an article in the New York Times in 2006 saying that American rye whiskey was poised to make a comeback after it was really almost dead, it caught my eye and started some discussions with John and say, it kind of almost just for fun, saying, wouldn't it be fun to bring rye whiskey back to Pennsylvania? Because at that time, nobody was making whiskey in Pennsylvania anymore. So we talked about it for a couple of years. We got serious about it in 2009, did some research with Michigan State. Well, pardon me, I think I need to clear my throat.
Medicinal purposes, of course.
Medicinal purposes only, of course.
Distillery, heal thyself.
Exactly. As my grandfather would say, a little bit of medicine before dinner. So we did some research with Michigan State on some of the origins of the Pennsylvania style, and we were able to test recipes with them. Played with the different. We use quite a bit of malt by American standards in our recipe. It's 80% grain, 20% malt, and the malt, the malted barley we use a 2-row beer style malt, which after looking at an article that came out this past week by Michael Veach, he talked about how Colonel Taylor said he only used beer malt as well. So I think we're in good company there. So we started distilling in 2011. And we've been selling our whiskey since a couple of years after that, once we started getting some aged stocks. And now we have a range of products ranging from our classic 90 proof rye. We have our 4+-year-old straight whiskey and some finished whiskeys. We do a vermouth barrel finish, a port barrel finish, and some fun things we do we take some barrels after they've been used to make our whiskey, and then we empty the whiskey out. We put maple syrup and sometimes honey back in the barrels, and then when they take the maple syrup or the honey out, we sell that, and it's pretty delicious. And then we put aged whiskey back in again. So our honey and maple finishes are very subtle. They're not very overwhelmingly sweet. They just have a little kiss of the honey and the maple on them. We only sell locally, mostly at the distillery. And so we have a range of products, but all we do is rye. John and I have both decided that we're going to focus on one thing and try to do that very well. We're tempted to do a malt. We have some guys, a couple of companies in Pennsylvania, Deer Creek Malt House, for example, making some excellent barley malts. And so we're thinking of doing something like that, even, maybe just incorporating some more exotic malts into a new recipe, maybe. I don't know. So that's, we've been, we're now in Pennsylvania, of course, selling very well locally, but across the states as well. And tonight, I'm drinking this is our second Founder's Barrel. We've been selling single barrels to retailers across the country. John and I decided to start picking them ourselves. So this is our second one we've picked, and we just bottled it this week. And it's a 5.5-year-old single barrel rye. So that's kind of where we are.
And one of the things, and I've got your rye whiskey finished in vermouth here,
Right.
but Alex, you guys have also experimented with rye and vermouth with your El Clasicos, and you're getting ready to do another release of that, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we did a huge test on maturation some years ago, where we kind of bought all kinds of wine, ex-wine barrels, spirit barrels, Calvados, cognac, Armagnac, 10, 12 different kinds of rum casks, Madeira, PX, Oloroso, Amarone. So Muscatel, whatever we could get our hands on, because we do a special type of whiskey. It doesn't taste like a Scotch whiskey. How does that work with other flavors? So we wanted to test both our rye, a non-peated single malt, and our peated single malt with all these different kinds of expressions and find out what will happen in a 2 to 3 year period. And one of the great things was when we played around with the vermouth, the Spanish vermouth. Just became awesome. And you know, Dad's hat,
Yeah.
but how amazing that can be. We actually also do a maple syrup finish that's also just ridiculously good. I really love it.
Yeah,
That sweet notes and licorice and yummy. So it is, in Stauning we want to have fun when we make whiskey. So it's fun to play around and do tests. We've made a mezcal finish. We call it Bastard. It's actually the bottle we have here. Also very fun. It's not smoky, but it's kind of umami in the notes with the rye. So again, and I think rye is exceptional. It's so much more absorbent to flavors than single malt. It's quite fun actually when we put a 3-year-old rye in a for example a vermouth cask, and we put a 3-year-old single malt in a vermouth cask. After about 2 weeks, we can taste the vermouth in the rye. It takes about 4 or 5 months before we can taste it in a single malt. So it's much more fun to play around with the rye whiskey.
Hey, Alex, I have a question for you, if you don't mind.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, we've played with. We use some malted rye in our recipe, and I find you mentioned licorice, and I'm curious. Have you found that's a flavor I catch very quickly with our malted rye? Is that something is that something where you think there's a connection there?
Yes, absolutely. In the beginning, we would just thought, well, we're from Denmark. We eat a lot of licorice. So is it just our minds, playing a trick, But no, there is a hint of licorice in it, and all of them, not just one of them, but all of them. Together with we have our new make is very fruity. So we have apple, pear, and also citrus, citrus peel, but the licorice is also there. Very fascinating. Yeah, interesting actually that you also.
Did you see the same thing? That's great.
Yeah,
that's great.
Well, I remember when Alexandra, your PR person here in the States, sent me samples of your ryes and stuff. She also included some whiskey flavored licorice that you guys had been involved with.
So that's curious. Cool.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's actually not whiskey yet. They put into the licorice. It's actually our curious. This is the curious, and curious is a peat smoked. Well, actually, it's peat and heather smoked rye new make. So kind of a mezcal type. It tastes like mezcal. I've actually fooled a mezcal producer in Athens. He thought it was mezcal he tasted. It was not very nice of me, but I couldn't resist the temptation of let me taste it. And they put that stuff into the licorice. They now have 6 barrels, and every time they make a new batch of this licorice, it's a bit older, the alcohol going into the licorice. So it'll kind of change on the next coming years. So from the new make to hopefully finished whiskey in some years in the licorice.
And the question has been made about anyone doing peated rye, and you've done peated rye, right?
Yes, we've done peated rye, and we've done a combination of peat and heather smoked rye.
And Tyrone Coty, our pal up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, does bastard mean something else in Danish? Perhaps it means tasty. Can you explain the naming behind that? Or
yes, well, actually, the idea came from this is the first bottle in our research series. And if you look very closely, it's a dog, but it's a dirty dog. So it's not a white dog, it's a black dog, this one. And it has some cuts in it where you have smoke coming out of the cuts. So it's a head, heart, and tail. And when we then made the second research series bottle, we had to bring in the dog again. And doing a rye whiskey aged in mezcal, we thought that was kind of a bastard combination, taking rye and aging it mezcal. So that's where the name comes from, bastard, because it's a bastard whiskey somehow.
Okay, that makes a certain amount of sense here.
Yeah.
Herman, I have to ask, how did you guys come up with the idea to do the vermouth finish in the first place?
This was actually pretty early on, like 2014. I think John and I, when we first started, we had a fair amount of extra time on our hands because we weren't as busy as we are now. And typically Friday afternoons, we would set up a couple of lawn chairs just outside the distillery, and would make some cocktails and light up a cigar and sort of watch the trucks come in and out of the parking area. So John is a big Scotch guy. He likes his Scotch, and he was talking about port barrel finish or maybe sherry cask finishing. And we were drinking in Manhattan at the time, and somebody brought us a bottle of Rye vermouth from California, and we were trying that vermouth that was new to us in our cocktail, and we liked it a lot. And so while we were talking about the idea of doing a cask finish in a port barrel, the idea of doing the vermouth barrel finish kind of popped into our heads as we were having our board meeting on the front of the distillery. And so we called the guys at Rye Vermouth at Quaddy Wineries in California and said, "Hey, we love your vermouth. Would you be willing to give us some of your used casks? Because they do some cask finishing in their for the vermouth." And we struck up a partnership with them, and we've been working with them ever since. We also use their, frankly, I mean, we probably breaking some regulation somewhere because our port barrel finish is not technically it's not a port. They're not allowed to call it a port. So we use a barrel of a port style wine that they call Starboard because they can't call it port. So that's a connection we have with the Quaddy Winery people, and it's been very successful. They make great dessert wines. And I love their vermouth. If you haven't tried Rye vermouth, it's an excellent product. And that's kind of how we stumbled upon it, enjoying a cocktail on a Friday afternoon, discussing what we should do with the business.
And Nurse Dave's Shaving World wants to know how that port finish compares to, I guess, High West's Midwinter Night's Dram. And I don't know if you guys have tasted those, but
Yep.
I think it compares pretty well because I've tasted both your port finish and the Midwinter Night's Dram.
Yeah, our port, the Starboard port it's not a full, it's not as sweet as some other ports. So it gives it a little bit more of an edge to it, but it is quite fruity. So what we do is we barrel select the spiciest barrels go into our port finish because we think that provides a nice contrast to the port. And we don't want the port to be overwhelming the whiskey. We want it to be whiskey first with just a little hint of the port next to it. So we're conscious of the barrels we choose to go into that because we want a nice balance and contrast between the two.
We have a question from Dave Kuhn, and this one's for you, Alex. How would you describe the whiskey culture of Denmark?
That's a big question, that one. I think whiskey culture in Denmark is fairly new compared to, for example, the US. So Denmark has been an aquavit country, snaps country for many, many, many years. So we really haven't had that whiskey culture in Denmark until, I would say, the 80s, perhaps 90s. And due to probably the interest in Scotch whiskey from Sweden, single malt whiskey, it came back in late 90s. It disappeared for some years and came back in the late 90s. But now it's really grown the last years. And after we started in 2005-06, I actually think we now have 25 distilleries doing whiskey in Denmark now. Not all of them are whiskey distilleries. I would say we're probably only 3 or 4 kind of pure whiskey distilleries, whereas we are, I think one or two are only whiskey, and not doing different kinds of funny things on the side, gin, for example, but only whiskey. So it's growing rapidly. And again, you've had the culture of rum, aged rum, for some years, and the natural step from rum is into whiskey. You see that very often. The sweet stuff. You use white rum, then you go to dark rum, then you go to special dark rum, and then you go into the world of whiskey, non-peated whiskey or rye whiskey, bourbon whiskey. Then you go into peated whiskey, Scotch later on. So it's become quite fascinating the last 10, 15 years how Danes have kind of embraced the whiskey culture and is really starting to learn about it. But I would say we're still far, far behind, Scotland, Ireland, the US, Japan on kind of the pure whiskey culture, where you really know a lot about it, how it's made, and you've been to a lot of distilleries, because there is not a lot of distilleries in Denmark. Not a lot of people is going to visit distilleries out. Well, Scotland, maybe only Scotland as a country. So still have a far way to go to really to be comparable to some of the bigger whiskey countries out there.
Herman, I want to touch on your background in chemical engineering, which is where you did your work before getting into distilling here. Graham Fraser wants to know if rye whiskey requires different yeasts or enzymes from malt whiskey.
Well, the real key with rye, and I think Alex mentioned this before, is rye can be very temperamental to work with. It can be very sticky. One of the things we were very pleased with when we worked with Michigan State is that they gave us a really good roadmap for not only the malt we should use and the enzymes, because we do add enzymes, even though we have a 20% malt level, which wouldn't require us to add enzymes, but we do anyway. And it was on the council of Michigan State, because much of the stickiness from rye comes from the residual starch that is not converted to sugar if you don't do a good job in your mashing process. So making sure you have a very tightly controlled temperature regime during your mashing, and our mash tun has a direct injection steam, which enables us to manipulate the temperature very precisely. So by carefully managing your temperature profile and choosing the enzymes and the malt you use, and then after that the yeast as well, those three combined, as a process, make the rye easier to manage, so that you avoid that nasty. Early on, there was more than one occasion where, even despite the fact we have chillers on the jackets of our fermenters, you'd come in the morning and there'd be a big mess, foaming out of the top of your fermenter. Or sometimes, in the pot still, the helmet of the still would just get full of foam because you had too much starch that was not converted during the mashing process. So paying close attention to the mash conversion, doing a good job in the temperature control during mashing. And then we're very conscious of keeping a tight control on the fermentation temperature. We have, with our chillers and jackets, we have an automated system now that keeps a 2 degrees C window on our fermentation temperature, which prevents overheating and the foaming and all the other problems you could have with rye.
And you guys use a hybrid still, essentially, right?
That's correct. It's a pot still with a side column, so that, and what that enables us to do is to tightly control the transitions between heads, hearts, and tails. Particularly for some of the whiskey we have is a little on the younger side, so we're particularly for the heads cut, using the extra rectification available in that side column allows us to make a very sharp heads cut, so that the whiskey that's the white dog that's going into the barrels is very clean. So even after a relatively short amount of time, you don't have that reek that comes from some of the nasty solventy heads. So that we use that to our advantage, and then we're also able to bypass it and run as a full alembic as well. So it gives us the flexibility of doing either or.
I know, Alex, you use traditional pot stills, and Tyrone Coty is tagging on to Graham Fraser's question. Can you talk about the extra effort you guys have to put into to clean the stills after you distill rye?
Well, actually, it's not that bad, but it's taken us a long time to come to that fact that it's not that bad. We do a very careful distilling when it's direct heated stills. And in our mashing process, we actually take care to get some of the solids into the fermenter. We actually want solids to go into the fermenter. Usually, when you have a pot still distillation in Scotland, it's a clear wort. It's almost a clear wort. But we have kind of a sticky, thick wort, as you would see it 200 years ago in Scotland. We've had several distillers come to Stauning and like, oh, that's how it looked, in the old days in Scotland, that stuff. And what that does, it actually creates a lot of problems in the fermenters. Because you get a lot of residues going to the bottom of the tank, so we have to mix it up before we pump into the wash stills. But that Maillard reaction, the scorching of the solids in the stills, do that very carefully, so it doesn't stick to the stills afterwards. So they're actually very clean, very clean, or easy to clean afterwards. But if you are too eager, not careful, it will burn inside the stills, and then you have the problem. Then you have 1.5 hours of cleaning of each still, and you have 16 wash stills. That's not fun. That's really not fun. And going into the new still house, when we started up the 24 stills, we had to kind of tune in the distillery. We had weeks, months where we actually burnt the wash in the stills, and I'm absolutely sure that if we didn't fix that problem, in due time, we had lost all our distillers, and they would leave us, and they were so close because they had to work over kind of every day. So not fun, but we kept up the good work and really experimented and tried. And again, yeast is really working with the yeast is super important, as you say. So we don't have a problem today, luckily. So it's easy. It's actually pretty easy.
And Graham Fraser wants to know why only a few Scottish and UK distilleries make a rye whiskey. I think I can handle at least part of that. It's that technically under Scotch whiskey's laws, if you make a rye whiskey, you can't really call it a rye whiskey. You would have to call it a single grain whiskey because they don't have a provision for making a rye whiskey. Scotch whiskey has to be either single malt or a single grain, and you would have to use rye as your single grain, and they wouldn't be able to call it a rye. I know Arbiki, as Graham Fraser points out, does make a rye while their single malt is maturing, and others have made it. They just can't really sell it as rye. Mm. I know there are some rye distilleries in the UK, in Great Britain, in England as well, but that's the reason why you don't see much rye in Scotland. Malt Mariners, our pals over in Germany. This one's for you, Alex. Any plans to do a single malt with a classic pot still Forsyth style at Stauning, or are you staying straight with the alembics? Well, I know you're doing single malt because I've got some here, the Stauning Smoke, yep, which is your single malt with smoked barley. So I know you're doing single malt. Explain how you're doing this one and the use of alembics at Stauning. I don't believe you are you?
Well, our stills are actually alembic stills. So okay. It's because when we started up in 2005, it was only a hobby. We didn't have the money to go to Forsyth to buy pot stills, so we bought some small alembic stills from Portugal. And as you all know, changing the shape, and size, and angles on stuff in a pot still will change your final result on the liquid. So going forward with the 24 stills, we had to kind of do the same design on the alembics. They went up to 2,000 liter alembics instead of 1,000 liter alembics, but we kept the shape and the size of them, and you get a really full character new make when you use alembic stills compared to the kind of the more common Scottish pot stills.
And that's what you found too, Herman, right? In using your hybrid still that can be essentially an alembic, right?
Yeah, I have a choice of doing one or the other. I mean, it's so we use it, and when we're making some of our whiskey is aged in the smaller barrels for a shorter amount of time. So we do a cleaner cut off the still. But when we're running for the 53s, which are going to age for a minimum of 4 years, we open it up and do what I would call fatter cuts, off the pot. So that's something that we were very pleased to learn. The guys at I think which is no longer in operation, the Artisan Distillery program at Michigan State. We were very fortunate to profit from their expertise and their experience on those kinds of stills. It's a Karl still from Germany, and we've learned to be able to use both the water reflux rates and all that stuff to play with how we pull the cuts off of it. So it's a nice tool, and over the past almost 10 years now, we've developed, I think, the skills to use that flexibility to our best advantage.
And I think that program faded away after the passing of Professor Chris Berglund.
That's exactly correct. Yes,
a couple of years ago, because I know he was instrumental in
he was
building a distillery on campus and working with you guys.
Yeah. He was. They were very generous with their knowledge and their time. We learned a lot working with them and the people on his team and some of the post grad students and things like that. So they were, they helped us. We tried different malts, and because we wanted to use a 2-row malt that would add some nice flavor to the rye. So our barley malt was selection, and a yeast selection was guided by the folks at Michigan State.
And the program, I know that some of his grad students and post-grads tried to continue that program and had not heard whether it succeeded or not, but I'm guessing from your comments that it has faded away.
I think so, yeah. I haven't checked in, but I mean, I keep in touch with some of the guys who have left there and are now working in other distilleries, but I've lost contact with Michigan State itself.
Well, I guess we're going to have to bring Canada into this discussion, thanks to Tyrone. As he points out, they do some damn good rye in Canada. Can you contrast your ryes to the ones we see in Canada, perhaps using Lot 40 or Alberta Premium as a comparison? I'm not sure if you guys have tried either one. I'm assuming you have at some point. But what is the difference, essentially, between Danish rye whiskey, the Pennsylvania rye that, Herman, you guys are making, and Canadian ryes?
Difficult. I haven't tried the Canadian ryes, as you mentioned there. So it'll be difficult for me to say what the difference is to the Canadian rye. But I would say that our rye probably sits in between the Canadian rye and the American rye in the flavor. So we use some malt, some barley malt, also in our rye, in our mash bill, and it's double distilled. So it's often people say it's kind of a single malt rye whiskey. It's not so dusty, or can use the word dusty and spicy as the American rye. It's more sweet and more kind of, wouldn't use the word simple, but easygoing than many of the American rye whiskies. And as I remember, I think I've tasted one Canadian rye. They're very mellow, easygoing, sweet. I would almost compare it like, the difference between Irish whiskey and Scotch whiskey. But maybe I'm wrong. Yeah.
Herman?
Well, I'm somewhat familiar with Lot 40, and again, most of I think the Canadian ryes, a lot of the older ones that have come on the market have a lot of a barrel characteristic to them, so that they and it's more grain forward than there's they don't have a lot of malt character, and so I think that those are the two sort of separating, but I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on Canadian whiskey. I really am not. I mean, I've tasted Lot 40. I know a bit about how they're made, but I've never done a deep dive into the differences. So I would hesitate to make a wrong step in that direction. So
we are getting some nationalist comments insulting the Canadians, and the Canadians insulting right back. So in your whiskeys, what percentage of the mash bill is rye in your rye whiskeys? I'm assuming, Herman, in yours, it's almost 100%, except for some malted barley, right?
No. Well, we have a lot of malted barley. Ours is 80% grain, 80% rye grain, 15% malted barley, and 5% malted rye. So 20% total malt, which by American whiskey standards is quite high. And particularly the 15% malted barley. Even some of the brands that are using a fair amount, they're using 8% malt, malted barley, but rarely 15. But 15 was the case back, when you look at the old school Pennsylvania recipes, 15 to 20% was the minimum because, you didn't have the crutch of using enzymes. You absolutely had to have enough enzymes in your mash bill to turn your mash. And if you don't turn your mash, as I mentioned before, if you don't get a good conversion of rye, you get a big sticky mess. So in the old school, and having talking to guys like somebody you've met, Dick Stahl, who was very generous with his time, and I met Dick in the 2007, 2008 time period, and he actually came out to visit with us at our distillery and was able to, gave us some of his knowledge and it's kind of the old school rules of thumb. And he said back in the the well-used expression back in the day, I mean, he said you would never try to make a rye mash without at least 15% malt. So you needed to have that high malt character. Now, of course, it's for the enzymes, but we also maintain the reason why we use a really good 2-row brewer's malt is we also think it brings a lot of good flavor. Many of the quote distillers malts are in America or 6-row malts. They don't have a lot of flavor. They have a lot of enzymes, but they don't have a lot of flavor. So we chose, again, with a little bit of guidance from Michigan State, we chose a 2-row malt, which brought a lot of that nice biscuit, and also fruit flavors in our younger whiskey, and that matures very well. So we're very happy to have had that advice from them, and use that 15% malted barley. We think makes a big difference in our rye.
That brings up an interesting question because that grain that produces a lot of enzymes but not a lot of flavor comes out of the commodity system that we've talked about in the past. I know that in Pennsylvania there is an attempt to grow things like the Rosen rye and a bunch of heirloom rye strains. And I know that, Alex, you guys are trying to use locally grown rye as well. How important is it for you to stay outside of the commodity system when you're sourcing your grain? Where do you get your grain from?
Question for me, Alex?
Both of you.
Yes.
But go ahead, Alex.
Yeah. Well,
you go first, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we want to keep it local, very local, and as small local, the better. Water, yeast, grain, everything we can do local is good for us. It's outskirts of Denmark, Stauning. It's the west coast. It's kind of the community where we don't have a lot of people, not a lot of big cities. So if you can support the local community, we would love to do that. The farmers is old friends. We have 2 farmers at the moment. It's old friends, school friends of 2 of the brothers, Vesterby. That's also 2 of the founders. And we agree with them every year. What should we work with? How should we proceed the next coming years on both the rye and the barley? In Denmark, the farmers would actually love to do barley more than doing rye now because they get more money for the barley. Sell it for beer, these barley types and the malt. But we pay them extra to do rye for us, because we feel it's super important that we don't go buy some rye we don't know about where it comes from and the style of rye. We've tried to use rye from other areas in Denmark, but not as good at the stuff we get there locally. And we have the possibility to kind of plan things together with good friends, and that's extremely important for us. In our mash bill is 30% malted barley and 70% malted rye. We've tuned down that a bit in the new distillery, so we're down at just over 50% rye now, and just below 50% with the barley, to create the same flavors as we had before, because due to the new mash tun and bigger stills and slightly different condensators. So for us, super important that we can control the rye and the barley and where it comes from, and we could look out the window and see it grow. It's within 10-15 kilometers of the distillery, all our barley and the rye.
Herman?
Yeah, in our case, Same thing. We're working with local farms. I mean, there's an interesting thread of information that comes out of Kentucky that American farmers can't grow good rye. And I think, as you said, with commodity rye, most commodity rye, or if you go to a grain elevator in the Midwest, the rye you're going to get from the grain elevator is going to be something that's tailored to just growing as a cover crop, not necessarily as a harvestable grain. And we're very fortunate. We've actually focused on one farm. We work with the Meese family, Meadowbrook Farms in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The Meese family, they're an original land grant family from William Penn. They've been growing rye on that land since 1716. And the current manager there, the current owner, is the Meese family. His name is Nevada Meese. He's a super great guy. I mean, he takes what he does so seriously. He spends extra attention. Like right now, we got a nice steady rain here. It's the middle of June. He's looking for a middle July harvest, and he waits absolutely as long as possible to be sure that we get the maximum ripeness in our rye berries. He actually takes a bit of a financial risk, because if you get a bad storm when those stalks are that dry, you get lodging. It knocks over the rye, and he can lose a lot of his crop. But he really is very conscientious about making sure he gets the most time in the field possible of very mature rye berries. And then he also takes a lot of care during the cleaning process. When he harvests the rye, he doesn't use corn cleaners like a lot of guys do. He uses he bought a specific cleaning equipment just for rye, so he gets a very clean product that stores very well. And he's also invested in grain handling and storage, so he keeps a very clean and long-lasting product that stores quite well in preparation for shipping to us all year round. And so I have a lot of respect for what Nevada and his family do up there. And he's also working with us and Delaware State, Del Valle University in the heirloom rye project we're working with at Rose and Rye. 10 years ago, when I was doing my research for the distillery, I found a lot of articles about this variety called Rose and Rye that was actually introduced to the United States at Michigan State University in 1909 by a Russian student who was at Michigan State doing his graduate work, who said, we have this really great rye back in Russia. I want to bring it here. And they introduced it to the United States. It became very popular. And even so much that when you look at rye whiskey bottles from the 50s and the 40s, and it would say made from Rose and Rye. Well, when we started calling farmers, I called the Pennsylvania State University Farm Extension. Nobody knew what it was. So somebody at Michigan State said, hey, call the seed repository people. The U.S. Department of Agriculture keeps seeds in a mountain in the western part of the United States in case of an apocalypse. They have seeds to start with again. So they had some Rose and Rye, and we started with Penn State originally, and then I lost connection with Penn State and shifted to Del Valle because they're closer to where we are. So Del Valle's been growing it. Nevada's growing it now, and we made a few test batches, small fermentations. I used to work in the flavor and fragrance industry, so we sent some of our white dog off to get some chemical analysis done, and we do see some differences. Even in the mash, the mash is a different color. So we're looking forward to this year's harvest, which is going to give us enough to really start moving into commercial quantity. So, I don't know. I mean, I've talked to the experts in the industry, in the grain industry, and they talk about how, well, heirlooms aren't always better, and maybe this isn't. I don't know, but we're certainly going to have a lot of fun trying. And in Nevada, one of the problems one of the challenges with Rose and Rye is that it's a very tall grain, and so it's sometimes a challenge at harvest time. But Nevada is, I tell you, the guy is just the best. He's like, hey, I got it. I'll figure it out. We'll figure out the right way to harvest it and store it. And so he's full on supporting it. And we're very fortunate to have a partner like the Meese family right here, right down the road here in Bucks County.
And I know Dick Stoll was involved in a lot of the Rosen Rye research before his passing as well.
Yeah, that was an outshoot of the Penn State work that was done. I mean, they connected with Stoll. Wolf connected with the Penn State folks that frankly got their first samples at my suggestion back in 2013 and 14. But yeah, I was very happy to see him get connected, and now there's more Penn State and the people they've been connected with are growing more and more of it. So we're hoping that in the next 2 years there'll be enough seed generated to really start spreading it out and reintroduce it to farms all across the state.
I'm just going to answer this question that Malt Mariners asked of Tabitha Spiritbaum. I know what her answer had better be, since Tabitha's on this webcast every week as far as favorite YouTubers. I kid, of course. But Graham Fraser wants to know, Alex, why do you think floor malting helps in your whiskey production, since you floor malt 100% of your grain?
The main reason is flexibility. It gives us flexibility to try new things, to do different kinds of smoky whiskeys, so we can control everything. We see everything. We don't buy something we don't know what's been through. We see it from the farm or from the field to the bottle at Stauning whiskey. So flexibility gives a lot of flexibility. I'm not saying it creates a better whiskey doing floor malting. Actually, I would say most distillers, big distilleries kind of laugh at us by doing 100% floor malting, because it's more expensive, it's slow, it's difficult to handle.
They'd do it if they could.
Yeah, they probably will. But
if the bean counters would let them do it, they would do it.
They would do it. And it's we just love the craft in that. Going there, checking it every day. Tasting it, controlling things I think that's what we feel important by making a whiskey. That's why I think a whiskey distillery makes whiskey. That's our world, but that's how we are.
Dave Kuhn says he finds a lot of similarities between rye and Scotch whiskey, and I'm going to tweak that to single malt. He feels like there's a correlation between spice notes there, much more than bourbon. Is it just that corn is too sweet? I don't think so, because corn doesn't add a whole lot of flavor to whiskey to begin with. So I'm not sure whether it's the use of the corn, the use of the new barrels, which you guys have to use with rye, Herman, I know.
Yeah.
But I'm just kind of curious about that, because I don't get those same similarities between rye and Scotch that Dave does. How do you guys perceive it?
Well, I would say bourbon probably, because most of the bourbon guys have backed down their malt content dramatically. I mean, there's not a lot of malt going, not a lot of malted barley, and the malted barley that is going into bourbon, I'm speculating a bit, but I'm guessing it's mostly 6-row malted barley for its enzyme content. So there's not a lot of malted barley flavor going into bourbon these days. Would be my guess. In our case, our 15% malted barley it's a very flavorful 2-row malt, and we think that does add a lot to it. In fact, we just did a tasting last week, and we have some barrels from 2016 that are showing a lot of a lowland Scotch characteristic to them. I mean, we think that's the malt sort of showing its face. So I think it depends on which rye you're talking about, and the fact that most of the bourbon guys have gotten away from using a lot of malt in their mash bills.
Alex?
And the best way of comparing, I think, is actually the new make. When you taste new make single malt, new make rye, and new make white dog bourbon, in my world, that's a huge difference. Sometimes, and probably also due to our mash bill, it's hard actually to taste the difference between the rye new make and the single malt new make at Stauning whiskey. And I've tasted several white dogs, and I think there's a huge difference. It's so much more. I wouldn't use the word sweet, but again, there's some sweetness in there you don't detect in a rye and a single malt, the rye and the barley. So I guess that the main difference for me you can taste it actually in the new make. But again, if you have a high content of grain in your bourbon, that will probably change things a lot. But the high content of corn, then you really taste the difference. But then the casks will hide some of that over the years. So try to taste new make. That's the best way of tasting the difference in those three.
Yeah, for sure.
Herman?
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. I mean, because we and it also depends on the difference between pot still distilling and column distilling.
Exactly.
And how the columns are run. I mean, again, I'm not an expert in running column stills, large column stills in Kentucky, but I imagine that there's a lot of a push towards efficiency there, not necessarily of grabbing all the flavor. So, but I think it has a lot to do with the mash bill and maybe the fact of the column distilling versus pot still distilling.
Herman, you mentioned before we got started that you and John are picking barrels on Monday. Tell me what you're picking barrels for.
Well, we've a combination of, the most important thing is that we keep a 6,000 liter storage vats, whiskey storage, where we add barrels to those tanks, and then we bottle from those tanks, but we never empty those tanks. So we're always adding new barrels back, and so we're always looking to complement and raise the bar of taste and quality of what's in the tank. So right now, we just bottled our straight whiskey the other day, so we have some space in the tank to add more barrels in. So, and right now, John and I are going to discuss. We have a slight difference of opinion on right now is what gaps we should fill. But so on Monday it'll be tasting what's in the tank, then sampling some of the barrels that we have in storage, and deciding which of the flavor gaps or which of the flavors we want to enhance with the next group of barrels that are going to go in. So that's part of it. We're also often called upon to pick barrels. We just had a whiskey club visit us last week, and they liked one of those Scotchy barrels I was talking about. So we know there's which group of barrels represent that flavor profile. So we're going to pick out a few of those and send them small samples that they could then make their final selection. So it's a Monday's going to be a long day. So.
And Graham Fraser he asked this earlier, still curious about your views on the optimum maturation age for a rye.
I would say that depends on what you like, flavor profile. I think for us, a young rye, we have, our rye is about 3.5 years old. It's vibrant. There's a lot of power. It's not like the old stuff where I think a lot of old ryes gets to kind of taste like each other. You really detect the distillery character in a young rye. And I think that's, for me, extremely interesting, the distillery character.
Totally agreeing with you, Alex. It's a great comment. We, our straight whiskey is between 4 and 6 years old. But frankly speaking, I was just tasting barrels from April of 2017 this morning, and I mean, I think they're absolutely delicious. I mean, and we have some barrels from 2015 that, again, they're starting to get more homogenized by the barrel, and we have a couple of test barrels sitting around from 2013, and I mean, people say, "Oh, they get excited. You should, I mean." That the 2017 I tasted this morning, I would pick that personally before the 2013. Older is not always better, and I think for rye, it's absolutely the case.
And Forrest is questioning whether, Herman, your process sounds very similar to a Solera vat process. I know we had that discussion before the show started, and It's sort of kind of similar, but not quite, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more like almost like champagne, And if a champagne is not a millésime, it means it's like at least 3 or 4 years of wines blended together. It's kind of like in Scotland they call it vatting. I mean, it's blending different barrels together to get a balance of combination that you're looking for, and also maintaining, for a small distillery, which is a big challenge, maintaining consistency of our some of our products. In our single barrels, we like the variation, but in our classic, or let's say our 95 proof straight rye, we have a certain expectation of flavor that we want to maintain within certain limits. And when you're a big guy and you're harvesting hundreds and hundreds of barrels at a time, if you know anything about statistics, the bigger the sample size, the easier it is to maintain that, your bell curve. But when you have a smaller sample size, you have data points all over the place. So maintaining a reasonable average of or balance of flavors is more challenging. So that using that tank enables us to manage that process a bit better.
Alex?
Well, yes, I agree to what you're saying, and I think when we also do batting, but in a kind of different way. And you mentioned that earlier, Mark, with our triple malt whiskey. So we have a whiskey called Chaos, and in that whiskey we do different age of whiskeys being vatted together in one batch. So a batch of Chaos consists of six barrels of rye whiskey, 3.5 years old, and 1 barrel of single malt whiskey, non-peated, and two casks of peated single malt whiskey going together, and they are about 5 to 5.5 years old. So 3.5 years old and 5 to 5.5 years old with the single malts, because we feel that fits very well together. That combination of age in the single malts and the rye. And some of the ryes we have are a bit older also. It just gives a different character. It's not that it's not as good as 3.5, and we have some that's 6 years old. I love them. They're fantastic. But you tend to lose some of the distiller character, and you get more of the cask character. And I think I've just hired a new guy in marketing, and he said, it's like when you use too much hot sauce. You kind of lose the taste of the food, and you get a lot of hot sauce. So that's how you used to think of the cask. Not completely, but you're on it. Somehow it's the right thing. So if you don't use too much hot sauce, but you balance it, you get a great product. So some can have 3.5 years, some can go for 5, some can go for 8. It depends on the distiller character and the product you make.
And Forrest says Chaos sounds diabolically delicious. It is spelled though Kaos, not
Yes.
CH.
And that's a Danish name Danish for chaos. and actually, can I add a story to that? Because
sure,
the distillery, Stauning, our name Stauning, is from the village Stauning at the west coast. But actually, the most famous Danish prime minister was named Thorvald Stauning. And he was elected in 1931, as I remember, as prime minister in Denmark. And he had an election quote, and it was "Choose Stauning or get chaos." And he won the election because nobody wanted chaos in Denmark in 1930. So when we started up, everybody said, "Oh, you have to use the name Chaos for one of your whiskeys." And how do you create a chaotic whiskey? Well, you mix rye whiskey, single malt, non-peated, and peated single malt whiskey together in one batch. And that is somehow chaotic to do that. And we can see when we try to put it into competition, can't go into any competitions. It's not a rye, it's not a single malt, it's not a grain whiskey, it's kind of nothing. So I don't know if it's a good idea actually to do this, but it's pretty delicious.
Herman, I want to let you go in a second here with the export thing, because I know that Dad's Hat was involved very early on in the export market. I remember running into you several times at Whiskey Live Paris. How much have you guys been affected by the tariffs, and are you at all hopeful that the European and Great Britain tariffs on imported American whiskeys might go away soon, as we keep hearing out of from London and Brussels?
Well, it's been devastating on our export business, as you might imagine. The tariffs have really, since 2018, we've only had one substantial order from La Maison de Whiskey. It was really just a minimum required to keep a couple of their customers who were already buying it But from a development point of view, it just put us dead in the water. So yeah, it's been unfortunate because we think we had a nice head start, and we started with La Maison de Whiskey in 2014, and we were making when they did their 60th anniversary, they picked a single barrel of ours, and I think we had a nice relationship going there, and the tariffs really hurt us a lot. So yes, we've been pretty, we've been hurt by that, and it's been pretty unfortunate. We are looking, particularly with Brexit, we're looking at making a direct connection into the UK. We're discussing that currently. We're kind of waiting and seeing to see what happens with the tariff situation. And we did see some announcements the past couple of days about how they're going to try to decouple the specific aerospace, and not drag everybody else into the party like they've been doing. So hopefully, if that releases American whiskey from the clutches of that negotiation, that might put us back in a good position to restart in the UK. And then what we do in Europe, I don't know, because that's a tougher one to break, because we have lost so much momentum there. And the relationship I have with La Maison de Whiskey, between the pandemic and the tariffs, I mean, I'd have to go through and figure out who to call these days. I mean, they've changed people, and so we don't have the same nice relationship we've had. So it's going to be an uphill battle to restart things in continental Europe.
You still call Thierry Benetat, I think.
I could, yes, I could. He's a fellow Wharton School graduate, and I've met him a few times. And so I do have his phone number. So worst comes to worst, I have to use that connection.
And Alex, your whiskeys literally just became available in the U.S. as of last week. How hard was it for you to get your whiskeys into the U.S. market?
Well, I thought it would be pretty easy, but it wasn't the case. I think Corona did a lot of bad stuff, especially on transportation, shipping. It's been super hard getting stuff into the U.S. Boats or ships sitting in the port outside New York, not able to go in. I think we started sending our first batch went to the U.S. in the beginning of April, and literally actually today we got the brand or the state registration in New York. So today they started selling in New York. We did a pre-launch some weeks ago because we thought things would go quickly, but it didn't. So things are slow. But now I see the future, being good, and I really hope that having the products in New York now, in California, also in warehouse in California, will start to open things up and make it easier. But it's going to be fun. I would love to go to the US now, open the borders so we can go. I went to my last trip flying was to New York and Seattle, where I met you, Mark, in Westland last year. Came back, and Corona kind of struck Europe and the rest of the world. So sending your bottles to the US, not being able to go there and talk to people, that's awful. I really hate it. So I would love to go there and go out and taste some whiskey and talk to people, because I find it interesting over there. And you are very open as a people to new products.
And I say this facetiously, just keep your whiskeys out of Pennsylvania, okay?
Yeah.
No, hey, don't make fun of Pennsylvania.
No, I'm saying that so he doesn't compete with you, Herman.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, no, there's plenty of room. Look, people ask me all the time. It's like, look, we're encouraging, and I'm involved in the Pennsylvania Distillers Guild. I mean, we're very encouraging of more players. I mean, look how many bourbons there are in Kentucky. I mean, so we're happy to invite more players to the party, and it's always fun tasting new whiskey. So if I can't get it in Pennsylvania, I'll get it up. I'll get to New York and get it. Or maybe Mark, you can. It's been a long time since you visited the distillery, and you're what, 45 minutes away. So,
Oh, if that, yeah. I
yeah,
need to get
so-
over
so-
there. I have to admit, I actually thought about maybe trying to come over today to do the webcast over there, but I have another YouTube event I have to call an iRacing IndyCar race at 7:30, and there was no way I was going to be able to get back tonight
Nice.
in time after leaving there and packing everything up to do both tonight. So I had to do it from here. But I had actually thought about trying to come over and do it from over there. But I will get over there because we had talked about toasting that Icons of Whiskey thing that I won a while back. And I do want to get over there to do that.
Congratulations.
And Tyrone Cote wants to know if Wharton is Boston. Wharton in Boston next to those other great schools. No, Wharton's in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. And I think Tyrone knows that.
Yeah. Boston?
Alex,
are there any universities in Boston?
Wait a second. My daughter went to Boston College. Don't start that stuff.
No, well, that is in Boston, not in Cambridge, but
Actually, it's in Chestnut Hill, but I won't go there. Alex, you
true.
mentioned when we got together last year at Westland, Stauning is actually hosting the World Whisky Forum in September. Give us a quick plug for that for those who are in the industry who might be able to make the trip over in September.
Yes, well, World Whisky Forum this year, I think World Whisky Forum has been to 3 or 4 places now, Cotswolds and Westland and a couple of more distilleries. Pretty interesting. Look into the world of whiskey and have different subjects every year, or themes every year on whiskey. This year, the theme is sustainability. So we will be talking a lot about transportation and how to be sustainable in the distillery, your products, and we have a distillery that's quite sustainable. We're not all the way there. It's not perfect, but we're doing our best to use all the energy the best way possible. To local grains, don't do a lot of transportation, packaging, all that. And we're working a lot on that in Stauning. So I think that Dave Broom and the rest of the team thought it would be the perfect place to do things this year in Denmark. And we, Vestas windmills, stuff like that. We do a lot of looking into innovation and sustainability. So it's going to be fantastic. We have a lot of great guests, speakers coming from around the world. Hopefully, if everything goes well, you don't know with Corona how things can change, but it'll be the end of September. We're going to do a live with 75, 80 people at the distillery, 3 days with dinner and tastings and a lot of interesting people, amongst Noma also coming, the kitchen chef or the head of spirits will join and talk about sustainability at the restaurant Noma in Denmark. Very interesting, and we have a virtual part also because we know that a lot of people won't be able to travel this year. So we're going to do a virtual World Whisky Forum also. As I remember, it's £30, something like that, per ticket, virtual, and is it 1,200, 300? No. £1,000, I think, for the physical ticket to go to Denmark. But everything is paid there for all 3 days: hotel, food, everything, dinner. It's going to be amazing. A lot of fun.
I know that I am going to try to make it over there if I can for the physical event. I would love to come because I learned a lot during the event at Westland in
fantastic,
February, early March of last year. And I would love to try to make it over for that. And we'll try to see what we can do about that to come over and cover it. But let's see here. We had a question, and we'll just do one final question here. Oh, well, actually, before we get to the final question, Chris Tetsenko, our pal down in Australia, down in Brisbane, are your guests' products getting down under it all? Have you guys managed to get anything to Australia yet, either of you?
Not yet, but we will next year, according to our plan. So Australia is on the map next year for Stauning whiskey.
Herman?
We have had some of our products make it into Australia in the past. The company who was distributing us was buying it from La Maison de Whiskey, Singapore, and that connection seems to have been lost. And we've been approached by another distributor in Australia, and we're discussing with them. So it's possible in the next 6 months we'll be back.
We'll keep us posted on that, and we'll let Chris know. Our final question from Graham Fraser. What do you two think is the future of rye whiskeys? Obviously, you've both bet the future of your distilleries and your companies on rye whiskey in a lot of ways. So what do you think the future is? And we'll start with you, Herman.
I think it's very bright. I mean, we still continue to enjoy, as a market, a good growth. I think a lot of people are still discovering rye whiskey. I mean, you look at it, the size versus the total market, it's still quite small. So there's a lot of potential to find new customers and new customers to find us. Rye whiskey, at least in the case of in our case, we design our 90 proof to be very well adapted for cocktails, and a lot of the classic cocktails, the old school American cocktails are built originally on rye whiskey, so that still helps fuel some of our growth and is an avenue for a lot of fun. I mean, we have a lot of fun on the cocktail side with our whiskey, and so I'm very optimistic. I mean, it's funny, you get people come in and to visit us last year, and we haven't had we start doing tours again soon, but people come in and still a lot of whiskey consume. We had a whiskey club in on Sunday. It was our first real group visit since the pandemic, and some of these guys are mostly oriented towards Scotch, and it's a real discovery process for them. So it's fun, and it's so much fun to welcome people into your world, because we think there's a lot of fun and a lot of new things to learn. So that's what I think.
Alex?
I think there's a great and amazing future for rye whiskey. I'm absolutely convinced about that. I've been on this journey since 2005, and more people just love to try rye whiskey. And I would say one of the biggest advantages of rye whiskey is that it doesn't taste like a single malt whiskey. And we have a lot of women and people new to whiskey that really loves to drink our rye whiskey, because often they say it's a bit like aged rum, a spicy aged rum. So it's a connection into the world of whiskey with the rye whiskey that we haven't seen before. And again, as you say, Herman, with the cocktails just growing massively around the world, people are playing around trying to make great cocktails. See that cocktail bars all over the world and want to try that back home. Bartenders tend to use rye instead of bourbon now, because they want to go back to how it was made, in the 30s and before that. So endless possibilities in rye, and you see that not just in Denmark, UK, US again, really revival in rye. Australia, Germany, UK, Scotland. Who would imagine Scotland rye whiskey? So it's here to stay. I'm pretty sure about that.
All right. And with that, we will call it a night, because we've managed to kill an hour and 18 minutes that none of you will ever get back. And I kid about that, of course, but we've had a lot of fun. I want to thank our guests, Alex Munch of Stauning Distillery in Denmark, who has stayed up past midnight to be with us tonight, and Herman Mihalich, our pal from Dad's Hat, just across the Delaware River in Bristol, Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia. If you're visiting Philadelphia, it's really not that far to go up to Bristol and tour the place. And thank you again for doing this. Guys, I know that it's late for you. Alex and Herman, I know you had better things you could be doing tonight too, but I appreciate your time, guys.
Just dinner, that's all. Right now it's just going to be dinner. Alex, really great to meet you. I look forward to meeting you sometime in person. If you do come to the U.S., we're not that far from New York even. I'd love to host you and show you around to see what we're doing. So
I will be there for sure. Bet on that.
And Cheers. Let me know, because I'll come over at the same time, guys.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay. Cheers, guys.
Great. Thank you again for watching tonight. Join us next Friday, 5 p.m. New York time, 2100 GMT, 10 p.m. London time, 11 p.m. Central European time, and go search on the web to do the calculations for the time zone in your local area. That's all for now. Don't forget to listen to the podcast coming up this weekend. And until we meet again, I'm Mark Gillespie. Good night, everyone. Sláinte mhath.